Apple just released the first beta of iOS 17.5. Here are all of the new features, and even a couple things that we didn't get. I've got my iPhone 15 Pro Max successfully updated, so let's go ahead and jump into it, starting with the build number and download size. So here we are. Before I installed this beta, I took this screenshot. So iOS 17.5 weighed in at 6.48 gigs for my iPhone 15 Pro Max. Your mileage may vary depending on your device and of course what update you're coming from. So 6.48, a little bit more on the higher side, but not terribly out of the norm. Let's go ahead and take a look at the build number. As you can see, we are looking at iOS 17.5 with build number 21F5048F. For those of you that aren't familiar, we can infer quite a bit from that last letter of the build number. As Apple gets closer to the release of the software and the builds become more stable, that letter will get closer to the beginning of the alphabet. Let's first take a look at the podcast widget. I have it added here to my home screen. Now, when we go to play a podcast, I want you to watch the color of the podcast widget. By the way, we're going to play an episode of HomeKit Insider, which if you don't already, please go ahead and subscribe to that. That's my smart home podcast. We're talking about everything new with HomeKit. So when I tap play, it actually morphed the color of the widget to match the podcast that is currently playing. Now it has gone to that gray color to match the podcast. Let's try another podcast. This time it's Always Sunny podcast. Play the latest episode. Go back, now watch the widget. It's going to update. Boom. Match the color of the podcast that's playing. We can try this one here for Parks and Recollection. Again, matching color. Very cool. This one is just for EU users, but you don't have to use the App Store to download apps. You're actually able to download apps directly from websites thanks to the new iOS 17.5 update. There is a lot of asterisks here about how this works, but Apple did pre-announce this, so this makes sense, and it was something we expected to see with 17.5. Lastly, this isn't so much a feature as it is a bug, but if we go into the Settings application and scroll down to Battery, if you notice where it says charging title, Apple has left the variables in here. It does this because it sets these variables and then it changed for languages around the world. But these variables were left in place in this first beta. So we still have charging underscore title, charging underscore fixed underscore limit, and charging underscore off here. Optimized battery charging is enabled or as like actual text, but the other ones are just left in as variables. I'm sure that will be corrected by the time we get the next beta of iOS 17.5. There's actually a couple features that we didn't get in this beta that I kind of thought that we would. We saw these in iOS 17.4 during its beta process, but they were removed before iOS 17.4 was released. I thought we'd see them return here in iOS 17.5, and perhaps they will, but they are not here in this first beta. For example, Apple had previously introduced a way to use SharePlay with HomePod and Apple TV just by scanning a QR code. There's also a wider search bar for Safari that had been introduced. Can remove those little extra tabs there on the side. And we had seen a live activity for the stopwatch. Now if you start the stopwatch, it just stays in the clock app. In that original beta of 17.4, it showed up in the dynamic island and as a live activity on the lock screen. I'm really hoping that this one comes back. So when will iOS 17.5 be released? Apple doesn't publicize when its updates will be coming out, but if we look at last year's schedule, Apple spent about 6 weeks in the beta process for iOS 16.5. If Apple keeps with its track record, we could see another 6-week window for iOS 17.5. That would put us into early May. It's entirely possible that Apple is planning to coincide the launch of iOS and iPadOS 17.5 with the launch of some rumored new hardware. But if you want to learn more about those new iPads, you can go out and check my linked video. Otherwise, stay tuned to Apple Insider and be sure you are subscribed with notifications turned on so you don't miss any of Apple's upcoming releases.